Welcome to this explainer. If you're feeling totally exhausted after a long day at the office, or just completely burned out by the daily 9 to 5 grind, I really want to take a second to validate that. Modern work, it can absolutely be a slog. But imagine if your morning commute involved dodging literal cannon fire, or if your main job description required you to literally drink someone else's bodily fluids. No thanks, right? Today, we are exploring some of the most tedious, dangerous, and just outright degrading gigs that our ancestors had to put up with.
Okay, let's dive into this. Because, it's pretty easy for us to sit back in our ergonomic office chairs and complain about endless meetings or spotty Wi-Fi, but history was absolutely packed with bizarre, highly specialized professional solutions to problems we literally don't even have anymore. From the incredibly perilous to the downright grotesque, we're going to look at how people used to make a living. And honestly, I guarantee you'll walk away with a profound new appreciation for your modern livelihood. Section 1. The human telegraph. Before the telegraph was invented in 1837, just getting a message from point A to point B, especially critical, empire-saving information, was a total logistical nightmare. Since delayed info was vastly better than no info at all, highly trained human messengers were basically the ultimate cutting-edge technology of the day. And this brilliantly illustrates the contrast between history's two greatest messaging systems. On one side, you got the massive Persian courier network, which relied on these sprawling relay systems of freshly rested horses to carry written orders. But then, fast forward 2,000 years to the 1500s, and you have the incredibly fit Incan chasquis. The Inca didn't have horses, and wildly enough, they had no formal written language either. They relied purely on raw physical endurance, complex knotted strings, and absolute flawless oral memory to pass the king's orders along some of the highest mountain peaks in the world. To really put the Persian effort into perspective, just think about the number 1,700. That is how many miles the Persian royal road spanned, all the way from the major city of Susa to Sardis. They built this intense series of heavily guarded checkpoints called the Angarium, and by staffing these relay stations with fresh horses and riders, they slashed delivery times across their massive empire from 90 days on foot down to just 7 to 9 days. I mean, that was the absolute pinnacle of ancient postal efficiency. But if you didn't have horses, the job was absolutely grueling. The Incan chasqui relay system was built entirely on human leg power. They set up stations about 5 miles apart, so a runner would literally sprint those 5 miles up wobbly cobblestone roads, 10,000 feet above sea level, arrive at a little weather-resistant hut, and then perform the message out loud. The next runner had to memorize it instantly and then sprint the next 5 miles. You can imagine how easily a message could get lost in translation after a 5-mile uphill sprint at that altitude. Section 2, Dining on Damnation. Now we're heading over to 17th century England, Scotland, and Wales for a gig that was reserved only for the absolute poorest social outcasts. This was the harrowing ritual of the sin eater. Here's how it worked. When someone passed away, their family would immediately track down this local outcast and place food, usually stale bread and warm beer, directly on the deceased person's chest or face. Then the sin eater would come in and consume this deeply unappetizing Michelin star meal, complete with floaties, to symbolically absorb the bad juju of the dead person. They literally took on another human's bad deeds just so the deceased could go to heaven with a clean slate. And for this incredible sacrifice, they were paid absolute pennies and completely shunned by society, because locals believed the sin eater's own soul was now hopelessly polluted. It was just an incredibly isolating, tragic existence. But what's fascinating is how this tradition finally died out in the early 20th century. The last known sin eater in England was a man named Richard Munslow. Now, unlike the shunned outcasts before him, Munslow was actually a humble, well-loved farmer. But after suffering the devastating premature deaths of his own children, he took on the job out of pure self-sacrifice. He just wanted to offer peace to other grieving families in his community. It's a heartbreaking yet surprisingly beautiful end to such a bleak tradition. Section 3. Children of the Cannons. Moving out to the perilous high seas, where booming populations and rampant disease between the 16th and 19th centuries created a really overwhelming crisis: overburdened orphanages. And shockingly, the navies of the world saw these able-bodied children as the perfect, cheap solution to a deadly problem. So the crucial point here is understanding the terrifying reality of the powder monkey. Because they were small and agile, these young boys were thrust into the absolute heart of naval warfare. Their job was to sprint from the ship's deepest, darkest magazine down in the hull, carrying highly explosive leather powder cases right up to the active cannons on the deck. All they got in return for dodging rogue cannon fire, flying splinters, and deadly shrapnel was some basic clothing, a bed, and meager rations.
Naval records indicate these boys were typically targeted between the ages of 12 and 14, but look at this staggering number, 7. There is deeply upsetting documentation showing that children as young as 7 years old were thrust into these horrors. 7! These little kids were actively ducking and weaving through the absolute carnage of broadside naval battles just to survive.
And it took an agonizingly long time for this practice to finally sink. It wasn't until the end of the War of 1812 that the U.S. put formal regulations in place banning recruitment under age 12. The British Navy followed shortly after, setting an age limit of 13. But honestly, these rules were still frequently ignored. It really wasn't until the mid-1800s, when robust child labor laws were finally established and naval technology shifted, that this incredibly dangerous job was made entirely obsolete.
Section 4. The Taste of Health. All right, let's pivot away from the battlefield to something a little lighter, though. Fair warning, entirely gross. We're diving into the wildly subjective world of medieval medicine. Now, what's really interesting about this era is that doctors lacked modern chemical analysis. They didn't have microscopes. So to get a diagnosis, physicians practiced something called uroscopy. They relied on the theory of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To check your balance, doctors would inspect your urine. But they didn't just look at it. To get their data, these brave medical professionals were routinely snooping, sniffing, and yes, literally sipping their patients' pee. I know, it's disgusting. But because human taste and smell are totally subjective, they tried to bring some objectivity to the practice by creating heavily detailed reference guides. Just imagine a medieval pee chart. If it was clear, your spleen was acting up. Dark red, your liver was too hot. Stinky usually meant an infection. But astonishingly, they actually got some things right. For instance, if the urine tasted sweet, it was considered evidence of diabetes, which is medically accurate. They hit the nail on the head with the diagnosis, even if they had absolutely no meaningful way to treat it. Section 5. Pets for the Wealthy. For our final gig, we travel to the 1700s, focusing on the ultra-wealthy elites of England, Ireland, and Scotland. These estate owners were so rich and honestly so profoundly bored by their endless balls and horseback riding that they decided traditional landscaping just wasn't cutting it anymore. They started literally purchasing humans to use as garden decorations. Listen to these absurd job requirements from a wealthy 26-year-old estate owner named Joseph Pockington. He wanted his estate to have a perfectly rugged natural vibe, so he built an artificial cave on his grounds and hired a man to live inside it. He demanded his hermit, quote, live for 7 years without washing or cutting his hair or nails. He also couldn't speak to guests or ever leave the grounds. If he succeeded, he was paid the modern equivalent of $100,000. It was the completely bizarre role of the ornamental garden hermit. Now, to be fair, working conditions varied wildly depending on the billionaire you worked for. You had your strict hermits, like Pockington's employee, who were trapped in unwashed silence. But then you had more lenient situations, like Father Francis, who was employed by the Hill family. He was actually allowed to interact with the aristocratic guests. He'd tell stories and dispense comforting, mystical wisdom to people strolling through the garden. Thankfully, this incredibly odd display of wealth faded out by the 1830s, eventually being replaced by the unliving statues and garden gnomes we know today. So as we wrap up this explainer, I kind of want to turn the mirror back on us. We look at sin-eaters, powder monkeys, and garden hermits as completely ridiculous fragments of the past. But it begs the question, what are we doing today, right now, in our modern 9-to-5s, that our descendants are going to look back on in 200 years and think, I literally cannot believe humans used to do that for a living? It's definitely something to chew on during your next endless Zoom meeting. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into history's strangest jobs.